Welcome to our Just Talk, Talk Just panel discussion. Womanist Herstory, the challenge of womanist hope in an age of pandemic. Sponsored by Union Presbyterian Seminary's Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation and the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. The conversation taking place today is similar to the dialogue that happens in our academic classrooms. Union would love to be in touch with you about opportunities to further your theological education. Attend a virtual open house by contacting our admissions office at admissions@upsem.edu. Our panelists are Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, Dean of Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary of New York. Reverend Dr. Emilie M. Townes, Dean of the Divinity School and Distinguished Professor of Womanist Ethics and Society at Vanderbilt University. And Dr. Angela D. Sims, President of Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School. Our host and moderator is Reverend Melanie C. Jones, Instructor of Ethics, Theology, and Culture and Director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Reverend Jones, the floor is yours.
Welcome to another Just Talk, Talk Just series, sponsored by the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation, as well as the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership at Union Presbyterian Seminary. We begin tonight in memory. The Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership joins the Muslim community in mourning the loss of a prolific Muslim womanist scholar, Dr. Deborah Majid. Deborah Majid was Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies and the Edwin F. Wow Jr. Distinguished Service Professor. She was named the first African-American woman and first Muslim to earn tenure at Beloit College. She made an indelible impact through her teaching and scholarship in the areas of religious studies, Islamic studies, cultural and identity studies, and womanist studies. As both scholar and practitioner, Dr. Majid forged a path for greater public awareness of Islam, the American Muslim experience, the African American Muslim perspectives, and gender and Muslim identity. For more than 20 years, Dr. Majid's teaching and scholarship transformed communities. Her students speak well of her contributions through the Under Koffler Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching at Beloit College, an honor that is based on student nominations. Dr. Majid authored numerous articles, book chapters, and most notably a full-length manuscript, Polygyny: What It Means When African American Muslim Women Share Their Husbands, published by University Press of Florida. She earned her undergraduate degree from Pepperdine University, her Master of Arts and Master of Divinity from Fuller Evangelical Theological Seminary, and her Doctor of Philosophy degree from Northwestern University. We invite you this evening to pause with us in a moment of silence as we remember her legacy. May Allah forgive her sins, and may she always be remembered in paradise. Again, for those of you who have joined us, my name is Reverend Melanie C. Jones. I'm the director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. Tonight, we are here with a phenomenal group of womanist scholars to talk about the subject Womanist Herstory, Womanist Hope. Many of you know that March is recognized as Women's Herstory Month. The 2022 National Women's History Alliance theme, Providing Healing, Promoting Hope, highlights the tireless work of caregivers, frontline workers, and women of all cultures who advocate healing and hope for the survival and liberation of all. There is no question that Black women embody healing and hope in their efforts to transcend suffering and transform it into wholeness. From Ida B. Wells-Barnett to Fannie Lou Hamer to Mamie Till and numerous women of the movement, in the movement, Black women healing communities and igniting social change on the front lines in moments of devastation have ancient and deep roots. The question tonight is, how does this witness of Black foremothers model pathways to hope for ourselves and the betterment of all? Moreover, womanist scholars have long traced a long line of Black women who have been concerned, who have been committed to the survival and liberation of the African American community and of all. What is a womanist theology of hope in this contemporary era? This Just Talk Just conversation, Womanist Herstory, Womanist Hope, seeks to emphasize the powerful influence of Black women concerning the enduring struggle of freedom and flourishing in America, while gathering the voices of decorated womanist scholars on the challenge of womanist hope in an age of pandemic, or what feels like to many of us, never-ending despair. There are three women. These three women who are gathered with us need no introduction. But the Baptist preacher in me can't help but give honor where honor is due. We are joined tonight by the very Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, who is Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary and the Bill and Judith Moyers Chair in Theology at Union. She also serves as the canon theologian at the Washington National Cathedral and theologian in residence at Trinity Church, Wall Street. Dean Douglas is widely published in national and international journals, including her groundbreaking and widely talked works like The Black Christ, Sexuality and the Black Church, A Womanist Perspective, What's Faith Got to Do with It? Black Bodies, Christian Souls, Black Bodies and the Black Church, A Blues Stand, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, and her latest, Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter. A native of Dayton, Ohio, Dean Douglas was ordained at St. Margaret's Episcopal Church and is the first Black woman to be ordained an Episcopal priest in the Southern Ohio Diocese. Also the first to receive the Anna Julia Cooper Award by the Union of Black Episcopalians. Welcome, Dean Douglas.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Our second panelist tonight is the Reverend Dr. Emilie Townes, who is a distinguished scholar and leader in theological education, the Dean of Vanderbilt Divinity School, and also the Distinguished Professor of Womanist Ethics and Society. Dean Townes' broad areas of expertise include Christian ethics, cultural theory and studies, postmodernism, and social postmodernism. She is the author of the groundbreaking book, Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil, Breaking the Fine Reign of Death, African American Healthcare and a Womanist Ethic of Care, In a Blaze of Glory, Womanist Spirituality as Social Witness, Womanist Justice, Womanist Hope, and co-edited Womanist Theological Ethics, a Reader, as well as Religion, Health, and Healing in African American Life. Dean Townes, who was born in Durham, North Carolina, came to Vanderbilt from Yale Divinity School, where she served as the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of African American Religion and Theology and the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs. She also previously was the Carolyn Williams Baird Professor of Christian Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and is a contributing blogger for the religion page of the Huffington Post. Welcome, Dean Townes.
Thank you.
Our third panelist, the Reverend Dr. Angela D. Sims, is the first woman president of Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School and the first president to lead CRCDS at its new location, 320 North Goodman Street in Rochester, New York. She is also the first Black woman president to lead any Rochester area college. Prior to her appointment at CRCDS, she served as Vice President of Institutional Advancement and the Robert B. and Kathleen Rogers Professor in Church and Society at St. Paul's School of Theology in Kansas. She holds a PhD in Christian social ethics from Union Presbyterian Seminary here in Richmond, Virginia, and studied with the Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon. Prior to her time at Union, Dr. Sims completed a baccalaureate degree, summa cum laude at Trinity College, and a Master of Divinity with honors at Howard University Divinity School. She is the author of Lynched, The Power of Memory in a Culture of Terror, Ethical Complications of Lynching, Ida B. Wells' Interrogation of American Terror, co-edited volume, Womanist Theological Ethics, a Reader, and the lead author of Religio, Political Narratives in the United States, from Martin Luther King Jr. through Jeremiah Wright. A native of Louisiana, Dr. Sims grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, an ordained Baptist clergywoman who takes seriously the prophetic imperative to do justice, to love mercifully, and to walk humbly with God. Welcome, Dr. Sims.
Thank you, Reverend Jones.
President Sims, excuse me. Welcome. So I am excited about this conversation as we delve very deeply into these questions of womanist herstory, womanist hope. Already, I called the names of folks like Ida B. Wells-Barnett and Mamie Till and Fannie Lou Hamer. And I'm thinking, President Sims, when we call the role in the context of these mother lines, of these great American thinkers and theologians, how might we be missing the names and voices, particularly of Black women, that have contributed to the larger American religious landscape?
So, Reverend Jones, thank you for hosting tonight's conversation and for providing a moment of silence to reflect upon our beloved sister, Dr. Deborah Majid. And your question about missing names and voices that have contributed to the American religious landscape points me to Alice Walker's essay, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, as well as to Margaret Shetterly's book, Hidden Figures, The American Dream and the Untold Story of the Black Women Mathematicians Who Helped Win the Space Race. Both of these individuals raised concerns about an ability to recognize and name persons who contribute to an understanding of that which ultimately shapes our worldviews. And when I think about whose perspectives have not been documented in various forms, I am reminded of the possibilities that await generations of scholars, documentarians, and others as they engage in processes of what Katie Cannon would call excavation, to expand our understanding of the American religious landscape. And though I am a bit reluctant to do a roll call, I am going to venture to name just a few women. Louise Little, the mother of El Haj Malik El Shabazz. Bertus Baldwin, the mother of James Baldwin. Alberta King, the mother of Martin Luther King Jr. Georgiana Ross Baker, the mother of Ella Baker. Maggie Leola Wright, the mother of Marion Wright Edelman. What might further study of these women provide to us as far as resources about understanding the depth of religious scholarship, the depth of religious engagement? And while I am also mindful that folks engage in biographical projects for numerous reasons to this list, I'm going to also offer some examples of a few thinkers and theologians whose lives and contributions to the academy and world merit more sustained attention. Dr. Dolores Williams, Dr. Jacqueline Grant, Dr. Carolyn Knight, and Dr. Deborah Majid. I'm encouraged by the ongoing endeavor to bring to the fore names and voices of women whose very embodiment is a theological statement. And this is evident in the work that Dr. Anne Marie Mingo is doing, her ethnographic project to document the contributions of Black church women during the 1960 civil rights movement, as well as the dissertation that is in process of being completed by PhD candidate Shatavia Wynn, as she is examining human agency embodied in Black women attired in white dresses in their service as deaconesses. And so to Dr. Mingo's work and to Professor Wynn's work, their work and that of other scholars, to include the work that you're doing, Reverend Jones, they serve as indicators of the importance to me of always identifying sources that represent a kaleidoscopic landscape comprised of women shaped and influenced by multiple religious perspectives that collectively broaden our own understanding of the relevancy and value of her stories.
Absolutely. This really helps me to think, President Sims, about the influence and significant contributions of womanist scholars to the larger religious American landscape. I'm thinking Dean Townes. For those folks who are just learning about womanist theology and coming into understanding of the contributions and gifts of the womanist tradition, how did womanism begin to capture the minds of theologians and ethicists in American Christianity? And what might you identify as these kind of primary contributions of the womanist movement to the understanding of American Christianity?
Well, this is my history. And since Kelly Brown Douglas was there, I think she can also give us a bird's eye view. Let's go back to the 1970s, mid to late 1970s, Union Theological Seminary in New York, where, and early 80s, where 3 PhD students who were Black women ended up in the program there: Dolores Williams, Jacqueline Grant, and Katie Geneva Cannon. One of the things that all of us in that era were struggling with is the notion of feminism. And we often had to put the modifier Black feminism, because what we saw coming out of feminism at that point in time was something that was more for middle-class white women, cishet, and was not speaking to Black women's realities, where we have to hold in our communities not only gender or sex or sexuality, but also race and class, age. And along comes Alice Walker with her book In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, with the subtitle Womanist Prose. It was at that point in time with these students and master's level students at Union, who were a significant portion of the student body by this time, if not in volume and in numbers, pushing the school to be more aware and also having to deal with Black male sexism. Let us be clear. Womanist started to resonate. Walker came up with a 4-part definition when her editor said, well, what's womanist? And that's a history I won't go into, but Walker sat down and wrote out the 4-part definition. The first one, that talks about the necessity of young Black girls having to grow up faster, because of the conditions in which they live in, and also the passage of knowledge from the older generation to the younger generation. The second definition about communities and relationships, same gendered, other gendered, and the necessity of helping everyone make it through, and the reality of miscegenation within the Black community because of the color pantheon we have, from light to dark folk. The third definition gets at it debunks notions of traditional beauty and ends with loves herself regardless, because she's loving roundness and darkness and fullness. And then the last one, which as we could say, set it off, was the fourth definition, in which Walker is critiquing white feminism. Womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. And what she's trying to get at, that there's a richness in Black women's lives that was not being captured by white women, not being captured by Black men. If you turn to the churches, you saw a spirituality that was bursting with women's presence, although often subservient. And Dolores and Katie and Jackie and Kelly and Linda Thomas and a few other folk said, maybe we can work with this, because we no longer have to say Black feminists for our concerns. We can say womanist for our concerns. And off and running. Now, much like many new things, the demise of womanist thought was predicted about a year after it began, almost 30 years ago today. What was not counted on was the staying power of the critique that this world can be better than it is, and we have the spirituality, the rigor, and the commitment to keep at it regardless. And so womanist thought continues to flourish. Now we have a new generation. Last I heard, millennial womanism was on the street, on the scene, Melanie. And that says we keep growing. Mm-hmm. We keep moving. Now we got to get clear what it means, but I, for one, want to see the garden continue to grow. Yes. I don't want to see a tight-lipped understanding of what can be womanist. Mm-hmm. I mean, we haven't even begun to touch issues like trans womanism. Mm-hmm. We haven't really begun to touch able-bodied womanism. So we got some stuff to do. What womanist thought allows us to do, I think, is it gives us a way to think our way into the problems of today and see them not only as social problems or political problems, but also deeply theological problems. Mm-hmm. And what do we do when we add the power of the holy in trying to figure out, what must I do? The big question in ethics. What must I do? What must I be? How must I act? Mm-hmm. What must we create? So let me stop there. I'm getting ready to start preaching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right there. I see the comments saying, yes, we are here and rising. And I think that last line that you pointed to, Dean Townes, about thinking about this as deeply theological is where I want to start my question for you, Dean Kelly Brown Douglas, about I remember Jacqueline Grant's notion that Black women identify with Jesus because Jesus identifies with us. And to ask, even in this Lenten season, even in this age of despair, how might we, given your work, parallel Black life with the life of Jesus Christ? What are the kind of theological concerns that we must be attentive to?
Thank you, Reverend Jones, for that question and for this conversation. And it is always a blessing and a joy to have an opportunity to be in conversation with my colleagues and womanist sisters, Dr. Townes and Dr. Sims. So how might we parallel Black life and the life of Jesus in an age of despair, in a season of Lent? You know, I often say this, and this is what our foremothers understood, as they never gave up. As Dr. Townes just said, never gave up on the belief that the world can be better than it is. And always had the strength to keep on fighting and moving toward a more just future. Now, where did that strength come from? And why did they never give up? It's because, as we say in the Black church, even in the Black Episcopal Church, they knew Jesus. And Jesus knew them. I often say it is the case, perhaps, not it is the case, perhaps it is the case, that captured and enslaved Africans were introduced to Christianity, perhaps through their European captors and enslavers. But this we know to be true, and that is, it was not the case that their captors and enslavers introduced them to God. They knew God in freedom, and God knew them in freedom. And therefore they knew that God did not ordain them or create them to be slaves. Now, why am I talking about this in relationship to Jesus? Because they knew that that name Jesus, that was on the side of some of those slave ships that took them across the Middle Passage into the slavery, had nothing to do with the God that created them. Then something happened on the other side. And that's where, despite their enslavers, they found Jesus. And Jesus found them. And this, they knew, was the Jesus of the God who created them. And so there was this, Reverend Jones, this identification with this Jesus that was born in a manger and that was crucified, just as they identified with the God of the Exodus. They identified with this Jesus. And so you hear their theological testimony in the spirituals, this rich, deep theology, that those spirituals resist any enslaving kind of any Christianity that legitimates any form of enslavement. And so they would sing, "Poor little Jesus boy born in a manger, world treat him so mean, treat me mean too." They whipped him up the hill, up the hill, up the hill. They whipped him up the hill, but he didn't say a mumbling word. Or, of course, "Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" Knowing that cross was that thing that allowed Jesus to cross time with them and them to cross time with Jesus, knowing that they were there. And so the first thing that we know about the parallel between Black life and the life of Jesus really comes to us through those sung spirituals that they understand clearly that Jesus is in utter, uncompromised solidarity with them, and that he knows their pain and suffering just as they know his pain and suffering of crucifixion. But it's more than that they understood. That gave them the power to know that they weren't alone and someone understood. But this very Jesus, right? This very Jesus that was crucified was also the Jesus that was resurrected. It was the Jesus that preached and pointed them to and said to them, God has promised you a more just future. A future where you will be free. And so that Jesus was resurrected, let them know that slavery of any form, that their enslavement did not have the last word, that the last word would be freedom, that the last word would be the justice of God that was freedom, because they knew that they were created to be free. And that's what allowed them to continue to fight for freedom, as I often say, that they knew they would probably never see, but they knew would in fact become a reality. And because they did that, that's why Dr. Townes, Dr. Sims, myself, and you can be in this conversation. And so the parallel between Black life and the life of Jesus in this age of despair is that Jesus knows our despair, meets us in that despair, understands what it means when it feels like, my God, why have you forsaken us? But in the end, right, even from the cross, Jesus says, into my hands, into your hands. And so it is that Jesus parallels Black life in terms of our suffering and in terms of our hope, and thus becomes the cornerstone of our faith. Faith in as much as it means partnering with God to mend the earth of its very injustice. That's what we do.
Yeah, I was really struck by your notion, Dean Douglas, of Jesus knows our despair. And I am thinking of a very recent example that we've been seeing in the news and media about the detainment of a queer Black woman by the name of Brittany Griner, who is being detained. And I think the detainment has been extended until May. But it raises the question for me, and this is for any of our panelists to speak with, how have Black women's lives been historically imperiled and unprotected, right? How do we begin to speak to this despair?
Reverend Jones, one of the things I think about are the various ways in which Black women's lives have been commodified in the church, commodified in the academy, commodified in corporate America, commodified in sports. And in some ways, it really invites us to think about this notion of, going back to Dr. Douglas's comment, what's really required of us to partner with God in such a way that we really take seriously what it means to free ourselves, so that we might then be agents to free others.
Yeah. And may I thank you for that, Dr. Sims. And may I add, just as very briefly, as we think of Brittany Griner, and I so agree with you, Dr. Sims, about how we have indeed, Black women's bodies have been commodified, essentialized, et cetera. two things, brief things that I want to say. One, that Brittany Griner is a Black queer woman. And all of the realities, intersecting realities of differences, Audre Lorde would remind us, are intersecting on her body and on her person. And so we must not, when we talk about Brittany Griner, it also reminds us that we've got to say much more and lift up our Black queer siblings. And I just don't know. I truly pray hard for Brittany, because it's not simply that she's an American, not simply that she's a woman, it's not simply that she's Black, it's that she's also queer. And she is in a context where that is criminalized. The other thing that when you talk about the commodified realities of Black women, Dr. Sims, I think of what Dolores Williams, Dr. Williams brought to the center for many of us and Sisters in the Wilderness. And that's how Black women stand in as surrogates. And I think of the way in which Brittany Griner is now being a sacrificial surrogate for so much that is going on right now. And I just, a surrogate in this culture of sinful violence on so many levels, and of power and greed and evil that is being manifest right now through the one that is Putin. And so I don't know. That is one place where I am just lost for what to do, except to continue to raise our voices loudly for the Brittany Griners of the world, and to continue to raise our voices loudly for her. But a lot is getting played out on the body and the life of this woman whose body had been commodified and essentialized as she played on a Russian basketball team. And so there are just so many issues and lessons there to be learned. And it's no accident that it's intersecting on a Black queer female body.
But, Dr. Douglas, you also point us to not only thinking about Brittany Griner and the evil that's being manifested in the Putin regime, but how that is simultaneously being played out in the U.S.
Yes.
With anti-gay legislation, the denial of medical care for trans children, with the criminalization of parents who support their trans children. All of that's intersecting at the same time.
That's right. And I'll shut up on this. And to remember that, one disproportionately represented in the population of those who die by the completion of suicide are Black trans youth. And that tells us something about what we must be doing when we're talking about those that are on the very underside of injustice and those who are most vulnerable to these crucifying realities of sin. That tells us something, Reverend Jones, as to where we would find Jesus. And And so the crucified Lord in this time of Lent on the way to Golgotha's Hill, we cannot forget about those most vulnerable in our Black trans youth. Emilie, you're on mute.
On mute.
Now you aren't.
Thank you. Don't confuse me. I've been looking at how have Black women's lives been historically imperiled and unprotected. And, my first response was being born. Simply the act of being born. And I wish it were not, and I'm not being trite or cute. Any Black woman born in this country, and I can't speak for other countries, is just as at risk as a Black man.
Yeah, if not more so.
And in some ways, the deaths and the threats on Black women's lives are not as recognized. Because we're always dealing with a larger patriarchal, male-centered culture where men's stuff makes the news. So Brittany Griner is nothing more than a pawn in the game between Russia and the U.S.
Yeah.
She had been playing basketball for that Russian team for a number of years. This was not new news about who she was and what she did. Why now decide to check her bags? Convenience. It is convenient to kill and maim Black women. And I don't know that I could say it any more plainly than that. Because we are considered less than, I don't care about that strong Black woman stuff. It is just something created to justify that we don't have pain and they can kill us again. I mean, so for me, just being born, I count myself blessed that I revel in being a Black woman regardless. That my faith, my parents, my community, the people I am around now recognize God's gift in creation. And my job, our job, I think, is to spread that good news.
Yeah, I'm inviting folks to send your questions as you have them to our panelists. But because point of privilege, I want to take the rejoinder response to some of this talk about despair. And for folks who are sitting now watching their CNN and other channels and looking at the confirmation hearing of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson and saying, Black women deliver victory to Biden and Harris, and Black women have been on an upward trajectory in terms of perhaps representation in the political landscape. What can or should our political parties be doing to support issues for Black women? And what does this nomination and confirmation of Judge Jackson have for us in terms of Black women and Black futures? Big question, but I want to get it out there.
So it's about a 4-part question, right? We start with this notion about political parties. And just let me say that it's the landscape that we currently have. But my hope is that something in Joe Biden and Kamala Harris would awaken, and they would recognize that this is a moment to really engage in a process of reforming the ways in which we think about political engagement, political life in this country, and to divest themselves of thinking that there's a way to going back to acting the way folks acted in the Senate 40, 50 years ago when it was still dysfunctional then and still not healthy, particularly in support of Black women's issues. I recognize that for many, Black women have been politically engaged because it was seen as a way to make a way out of no way, to make a difference, even if it was just a slight difference. But I also recognize that, as my 36-year-old daughter would say, her generation is not my generation. And so the foolishness that my generation might have tolerated is not being tolerated by a younger generation, and it shouldn't be tolerated. The question becomes, though, what are the ways in which these younger movers, shakers, intellectually engaged, theologically engaged, culturally engaged, socially aware folk can actually begin to shake up systems? My concern is that a half party system is not going to serve us well. And I say half party because, when I look at the Democrats and the Republicans, they're the opposite side of the same coin. And so a question becomes, where's the remnant that can begin to make a difference? As we are watching the suppression of votes, as we are watching this notion of taking back something to an era when none of us should want to return, and white women aren't questioning this move to regress, Black women are actually on the forefront. And so I get encouraged by the voices of younger Black women who are pushing the questions and not being satisfied with a sugar cube. Dr. Douglas, you're on mute.
Now I'm on mute. I told Emilie, now I'm on mute. But, that's the way Episcopalians are. We're usually muted. And I wanted to say amen to what you just said, Dr. Angela Sims. And so my Episcopal sensibility wouldn't let me say it. So I was on mute. But I do want to strongly affirm what you said and just add a couple of things to that. One, that Reverend Jones, you said, Black women being represented. And I want to just pick on that for a moment and say that representation isn't change and isn't power. And so that, we have to move beyond being satisfied with representation. And we have to, and being invited to take part in somebody else's agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And your daughter, Dr. Angela Sims, and my son, my now 29-year-old son, keep saying, aren't y'all tired of that yet? They're ready to say, we have an agenda and we want you to respond to our agenda. We're changing the agenda. And so representation means, we're gonna let you come in and you're gonna help us advance our agenda. And their agenda is not about freeing ourselves from the culture of sin that is racialized, patriarchal misogyny and terrorism. They aren't about that. They aren't about changing the agenda of white supremacy. And that's why white women, they okay with that. They aren't about changing that agenda. So that's the first thing. Representation doesn't mean necessarily power, and it doesn't mean changing agenda. So we have to continue to raise our voices to support these persons like soon to be Supreme Court Justice Brown Jackson and others, holding not only them accountable, but those accountable who think it was good enough, the Bidens, et cetera, good enough just to have them there. No, it's not good enough just to have them there. And if we don't support them because we know where they are, they're the outsiders within. If we don't support them, then they are not going to have that power behind them that will allow them to raise their voice in such a way to make the change and to be heard. And so that's the first thing. And now I've forgotten my second point, except to say that this political system that we're talking about is a system that was meant to protect a status quo of a white supremacist status quo. And we need to be clear about that. And so we can work within it as much as we can, but there's a generation behind us that says, no, that won't do. And we need to listen to them who continue. My son says, y'all like Groundhog Day, just going over and over the same old stuff and and not getting any further along. And so anyway, I could keep on going, but I'll stop there. But at the same time, don't let me minimize.
That's right.
Don't let anybody hear me minimizing and not being proud to my bones of soon to be Supreme Court Justice Brown Jackson or Vice President Kamala Harris, because I know this, that our mothers and our grandmothers could never even imagine a day where we would even be having this conversation about a woman who looked like them, that is sitting on the bench and is Vice President of the United States. So don't let anyone hear me say that I don't think that that is significant, because it also means that people that look like us in that next generation will say, I got that next. And when they're next up, they're going to change it.
And you know, Dr. Douglas, the other thing in highlighting Judge Brown Jackson, every one of the women that made that short list were uber qualified.
Well, we know we got to be. That's what our mamas taught us, right?
Yeah. Yep. We don't get in on a humble.
The beauty of these conversations is we get to exchange with folks all across. So I see here that Professor Naomi Washington Leapart, I think at Villanova, is teaching a class and sitting now with students in the course, Do Black Lives Matter to God? And she says, Black women continue to roll with God. But is this proof of our belovedness to God in the pudding of our lives? Black women's waymaking seems like it's not enough. Should we let God off the hook as it relates to Black women's suffering, or must even the liberating God be held responsible?
Oh, that's a both and question. Because I always have to ask myself, who is the God that folks are in relationship with? Because I'm not in relationship with the God of white supremacists. And I'm also very mindful that human beings in and of ourselves cause a whole lot of harm and damage and injury to people. At the same time, I cling to this hope that the God who is a liberator is ever present and ever speaking, even when it might not be apparent to me that that liberating God is yet there with me. But I think we do need to hold that liberating God responsible as well. Because I don't cling to a by and by type of freedom. I want freedom in the here and now.
Mhm.
And I want people not to have to suffer in the here and now because of someone else's evil acts.
Mhm. I agree with President Sims, and it's the God who is the God that we are actually talking about, praying to. I think that's one set of questions. And then I also want to say, and who are we, the people doing what we're doing to each other?
Mhm.
I think both have to be in the conversation together. Now this is ranging around that technical term theodicy,
Mhm.
and 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 Dean Brown Douglas can explain theodicy to us, because I'm just an ethicist. So I just use the words, you define the words. But seriously, the formulation that in some ways this question assumes is, why do bad things happen to good people? And that's putting God at the in the driver's seat and the doer and beer of all. And many years ago now, we put together a compilation, A Troubling in My Soul, Womanist Perspectives
Mhm.
on Evil and Suffering. And what happened in that book was not planned. Every single author in that book, all Black women, located the problem of evil with what people do to each other,
Mhm.
what we do to ourselves, and not with God. God is there, God is looking and listening, but a disinterested God, I have no interest in. That's the God of the enslavers. That's the God that sits passively and allows slavery and all of its evil and racism and sexism, all the isms to roll along like it's natural and healthy. So I want to complicate it. Not only do we not let God off the hook, we have to question what God is it that we are tempted to put on the hook. And is this a God of liberation? No, absolutely not. So I want to almost, I'm not going to throw it back. I will hand it back to the good professor in her class and say, let's struggle more with the interpersonal stuff we do and question the notion of God and any notion of God that sanctions suffering. Because for me, at least, that is no God. That is the devil dressed up, white robes.
Like white people.
Hey,
Oh.
look, I did not say that. Kelly Brown Douglas, you did.
I should say like whiteness and not white
There you
people.
There you
White, like whiteness, and I mean that. So hear that, everybody. Like whiteness. There's a difference between whiteness and people who happen to be white Americans.
When we were talking just a bit about Judge Brown Jackson, it struck me that all three of you represent foregrounding leaders at your educational institution, not only as scholars, right, but also as folks who are shaping what we know to be theological education for now and what will be, I believe. And I'm curious about your womanist approaches to leadership, or what is it about the womanist ethos that makes womanist leaders desirable as leaders of educational institutions?
go. Well,
Heaven,
sometimes
go
I'm
ahead, Emily.
sometimes I'm not sure they know what they've gotten themselves into.
Right. There you go.
To be leaders. Now that's my cavalier response. My serious response is sometimes they don't know what they've
Mhm.
gotten themselves into when they ask us to be leaders. And I think different institutions have different visions for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not a one-size-fits-all
Mm-hmm.
response from me. I will put it in the context of what I know best, which is Vanderbilt. They tell me that what they were looking for, I'm trying to remember back to the position description. They were looking for someone who was a scholar, a senior scholar, who valued collegiality and building community, and took scholarship seriously and the church seriously. And it would be good if we could continue to diversify the student body and the faculty. And for them, I was that person. I don't think that's the case for either Dean Brown Douglas or President Sims. Different things were going on with the folks who were making those decisions. But sometimes we actually fit the profile of what they're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And we're like, we are bonus points if we're Black and female, if we're in leadership positions.
And Emilie, while we might fit the written profile, when we show up and we are our authentic selves, the question often becomes, oh, or the comment might become, you are doing exactly what you said you were going to do.
And the whole new world breaks out.
So, yeah. Yeah. Then yes. And add to that. First, I want to make clear on my offhanded comment, and because and I really do mean, and I write about it all the time. There is when I talk about whiteness, I am not talking about people who happen to be raced white, or happen, as James Cone would say, just because you look like a white American doesn't mean you have to act like one. And so there's a distinction between people and the culture of whiteness that sustains white supremacy. I just want to make that clear.
Yep.
I think that to this question, when I echo what both Dean Townes and President Sims said, and for me at least, and I can only speak from how I view what being womanist means to me in the position that I now hold or privileged to occupy. And that is that it's not about me, and that I bring with me the hopes and dreams of those who could barely hope and dream to be free and finish school. I always talk about my grandmother who just wanted her grandchildren to finish high school. And so for me, womanist leadership means holding oneself accountable to those who are on the underside of the outside. We're the outsiders within, and to remind ourselves that we are accountable to the outsiders and those on the underside. And so to create access and space for others to be able to fulfill whoever they were created to be and called to be. And so to me, that's what theological education is about, and in helping as we train folks to go out into whatever ministries they're going to go out into, to help them to understand that we are accountable to those who don't have this luxury opportunity to sit around and think. Because you can't think when you're hungry. You can't think when you're just worried about surviving. And that, we are trying to create a space for others to be able to live fully into who they are. And that to me changes. If you keep that in mind, it's not about you. And if you bear that in mind, it changes even the way you react to those things that people do when they realize, whoops, you really are who you said you are, or oops, we really have this Black woman in here, oops, that you, and it makes you more accountable not to the institution and worrying about progress through the institution. It makes you accountable to something else, and it changes the way you lead. And the other thing that I want to say, and I'll stop here, is that Womanist, to me, leadership. And I think the three of us, because we've been in these collaborations before, it's what Womanist is. It's collegial. And it's when you know you don't know it all, but you know you got some other sisters of wisdom from whom you can talk, with whom you are not competitive, but with whom you are in a joint effort to create the space. As Katie Cannon loved quoting, Zora Neale Hurston, creating this, throwing up a highway in the wilderness for somebody else to travel along.
I could really have conversation with y'all all day, all night long. But I'm recognizing that we're coming to a close of the hour. And I want to end with a final question, which is a draw from the theme, Womanist Herstory, Womanist Hope. What is your hope? What is a womanist hope for this contemporary era?
In the midst of all that's going on, one hope is that with each morning and each breath that's drawn, it's an opportunity to make a difference, no matter how small we might think that difference is.
I'll end by the way I end so often when people ask me about Womanist Hope, and I ended my most recent book because I live by it. And that is, as I've always said, my great-grandmother, Mama Mary, was born into slavery. And I knew her. She died when I was maybe 6 or 7 years old. When I think of her, I truly think, and I've spoken of this several times today, I think of those who were born into slavery, those who died in slavery, and never, ever drew a free breath, and never believed that they would draw a free breath. But they fought for freedom anyhow.
Yeah.
They fought for the freedom that they knew would be, because it was the freedom that was the justice of God. And that is womanist hope. It is a verb, not a noun. And it is a testament of faith in the promise of God.
My hope is simple. And it is, this world we are in now is not the final word from God.
I believe that these conversations are the fulfillment of Dr. Cannon's hope for space and place, for there to be accessibility to these conversations, and that from people all over the world can have access to the voices, to the witness, to the knowledge and wisdom that you all three have shared with us today. So thank you for sharing this evening with us. And I want to thank everyone who has joined us tonight. Those of you who have been journeying with the Just Talk, Talk Just series, whether you have been journeying with the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation in Charlotte, or even the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. Thank you for helping us to make these conversations accessible, for joining month after month. And we look forward to another conversation coming up next month in April, where we'll continue many of these themes about justice and theological education. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you for watching. Join us again next month as we discuss racial justice and voting rights. Watch your email for details. From all of us at Union Presbyterian Seminary, go in peace.